It's been a month. I almost feel uncertain where to start with this, so I'm going to go ahead and get the disclaimer literally out right off the bat. Now, you see up there in the title, it does not say the word lamentation. However, I did not enjoy this game. Now, I'm going to be explaining a lot of the whys, or rather, I won't be explaining the whys, you will be understanding the whys as I go through this. But I want to make this clear right at the very, very beginning, because if the fact that I didn't enjoy this game means you don't want to watch this video, you know, you are now warned and you don't have to waste your time on me. And I also mention this because I know at least two people personally, you know, people whose names I know and I converse with, who recommended this game for me specifically thinking that I would enjoy it, and rather than reach that awkward phase of, oh, I saw you did a Dark Souls video, so did you like it? And me having to awkwardly kind of be like, well, you know, it was a game and I could talk about things and totally, you know, avoid the topic. I'd rather just be honest. No, I didn't like it. And it's a shame, because this game is, I would say, one of the most brilliantly constructed games I've played recently. And I just played Portal, for God's sakes. For the record, though, I think Portal is a little bit better constructed. But at the same time, Dark Souls does a lot of things Portal didn't, and indeed most games don't. But I'll be talking about that in a minute. Let's talk about the difficulty thing. I want to get that off right off the bat, okay? If you are someone watching this video and you want to say anything along the lines of the fact that this game isn't actually that difficult and you just had a really easy time with it, and I breezed through this game on its hardest difficulty 15 times, sideways, upwards, in a single afternoon, you are the kind of person I don't want to have anything to do with, please get off my video. Okay, now that none of them are gone, because I imagine most of my viewers are not that kind of person, I make that statement, though. I'm mostly joking, but I make that statement for a reason. Let's talk about Demon's Souls. Now, Demon's Souls was a game that came out prior to this one. Surprise. And I imagine most of you watching this are well aware of it. The only thing I have to say about Demon's Souls is that I felt it so unworthy of consideration and commentary that if you asked me to do a rumination of it, I would at best consider doing an assessment of it, because I simply don't have anything worth talking about when it comes to Demon's Souls. Really, I don't. I would spend more time talking about the concept of that particular player base and its target audience than I would the game itself, because I just didn't have anything that I felt was worth discussing in that game. And yes, I have both played and looked into Demon's Souls. Dark Souls is different, obviously, because I'm doing a video about it, and not just because I said I would. I am a man of my word, after all, but because I genuinely felt there were things worth discussing. You'll be able to tell this. I have no idea how long I'm going to talk, obviously. I'm not that good. But you'll be able to look down at the bottom here and see this is a blank minute video. But I am predicting this is going to be a pretty short video, all things considered, because ultimately I don't actually have that much to talk about. Okay, so just fair warning on that. But getting back to Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls was well known specifically for the fact that it had punishing gameplay. I'm going to define a couple things here really quick. First of all, I have been an advocate of not using the terms hardcore and casual, either of them, when it comes to gaming. And the biggest reason why is both terms are basically insults. And the people who like to, and the funny thing is, both terms are exactly the same function, really, when it comes down to it, as fanboy and hate boy. Because you're always going to look at the other as if it's worse than your own. Or to make my statement more clear, because I'm talking in circles again. If I think you're taking a game too seriously and you're getting too much into it, I can call you a hardcore gamer as if that's an insult. If I think you aren't taking a game seriously enough, or think that you're not trying at all, or you're just playing it, you know, afternoon, weekend warrior kind of a thing, I can call you casual as an insult. And both sides tend to view the other as the insult, whereas they view their own as something they can adhere to with a degree of pride. Which brings me to the real point, not the insult, but the elitism that is inherent within both. It is, and yes, even within casual gaming, there is a severe amount of elitism and loudly proclaiming. Now, I'm not, really quick, disclaimer, I'm not saying that all people do this, but I have seen dozens upon dozens of people who will proclaim themselves loudly and proudly to be a hardcore/casual gamer, as if it was a mark of pride. And that elitism leads to a form of classism, because elitism and classism are basically, hey! And that leads to all the kind of things that I don't like lack of communication, like lack of discussion, lack of analysis, lack of open discussion. I mean, video games are awesome, right? Let's discuss. I'm here talking about a game I didn't even like, because I believe so firmly in the idea of openly discussing it. See, this is my mentality here. So the very idea of trying to artificially chop things off like that bothers me. So I don't like using the word hardcore, and I don't like using the words casual. Instead, I try to find words, because categorization is still something that's useful. Let's not go to the other extreme of just calling everything the same thing, you know. So some categorization is useful, so I like to use the term when it comes to games like Demon's Souls of punishing gameplay. The idea is, and make this clear, that's not a detrimental term, okay? That's not an insult. There is a significant market for punishing gameplay. I myself have moods where I actually like playing punishing games. The idea of a punishing game is very simple. A punishing game is one in which you have to constantly be doing your best, basically, in order to keep up and indeed make progress, okay? But it's the reason it's called punishing as opposed to difficult or hard or anything like that is because when you're being pushed back, like if you make a mistake, or if you screw up, or if you do something incorrectly, or if you forget something or whatever, you are actively punished for your failure in such a way that it tends to lead to a cascade event. Okay? Now this, obviously I'm taking in huge generalizations, but this is just how this type of gameplay tends to work in general. And another thing that tends to be very common in punishing gameplay is they don't explain anything. You have to figure it all out for yourself, or buy the strategy guide, or go to the wiki, or whatever. But the point is, the idea is, you are in blind, you know, game start, figure it out. And you're told, like, the controls, and that's basically it. And you get to figure out the rest as you go. And again, there's an appeal to that, especially in the modern era, where in the previous era, gaming-wise, just previous to this one, about the first 5 or 6 years of the 2000s, tutorializing was so over the top that it got to the point where simply saying the word a tutorial in a game now has negative connotations. So there's a definite market for a game that has basically no tutorial, doesn't handhold you at all. It's worth noting, keep this in your mind, what I just said, by the way, the punishing thing. If you don't keep up, if you don't do the best you can all the time, you slip. You fall back, all right? You lose progress, okay? Just keep that in your mind. I want you to be thinking about that for the future, because all of this is kind of building to a big point. So, Demon's Souls' only feature that I felt was worth discussing was what I'm discussing right now in Dark Souls. The idea of that punishing gameplay. Now, I hesitate to use the word difficult or hard, mainly because those words are very subjective by their very nature, whereas a punishing game, which is actively trying to punish you for not accomplishing things in the manner that it feels best, is a lot less subjective. It's a much better categorization, I feel, for this kind of thing, right? Whether or not Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 2 is going to be difficult for you is up to you, not me, and not the game for that matter. Make sense? So, I will say Dark Souls, in my opinion, as a developer, does have examples of both proper and artificial difficulty. I'm not going to go into specifics, because I don't feel it's necessary, but I will say that, for the most part, I at no point felt it was irritating. The few examples of artificial difficulty never actually bothered me, not like they do in certain other games. I never found, like, a meat gate boss, for example. That was never a problem I had, and there was never an arbitrary you fail thing because of randomization, you know. So there was good design choices overall, which really kind of is Dark Souls in a nutshell. Good design choices. We're renaming these games, right? We renamed Portal Juxtaposition. Dark Souls is now renamed Good Design Choices. And I mean this sincerely. But getting back to the Demon's Souls thing and the difficulty thing, the problem is Dark Souls is the kind of game where if you released a demo for it, that demo would not actually accomplish the goal of a demo, in my opinion. Especially if you play the first part of the game in the demo. Now, it is possible to make a demo for Dark Souls which would work. They'd never do it in the modern era, but basically you'd have to play like a middle chunk. Say going through the forest after the wolf, whose name I can't even think of. That kind of a thing, right? But the reason I mention this is because for me, and I'm kind of jumping around in my notes here, to be honest with you. I'm just trying to segue these smoothly. For me, playing the first few minutes and indeed hour or so of the game didn't sell me on the game at all. In fact, it was basically just kind of like, okay, stick and move, stick and move, stick and move, corridor, stick and move, corridor. Na, 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 na. The combat, to put it bluntly, did not sell me on this game. That's not what I like about the gameplay, because I do genuinely enjoy the gameplay of this game. It's one of the reasons I agreed to go ahead and continue slogging through it. The second reason being that I said I would, and the third reason being it's my job. It would be a very rare game indeed for me to actually put it down and say, nope, not bothering. And if I'm doing a rumination, or I should say a lamentation on that kind of a game, then what the hell? But I digress. So the combat didn't really sell me on the game, but what did is the nature of the way the game flows. You start off and it's like, okay, go here, cliff, tunnel, this thing, okay, blah, blah, blah. But then the game, like, without any real noticeable transition, just opens up. And you find yourself being able to go wherever, to get wherever, find the treasures, or find the different, the different chunks of humanity that you can use in order to sacrifice, in order to the different covenants, in order to get your abilities in this thing, and to level up your character, and get your soul level, blah, 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 blah. I know this is not a new observation, but I just have to share it because I think this game really is a Metroidvania. And I know approximately half of my audience is going to go, well, duh. And the other half is going to go, huh? I imagine there's going to be no in-between on this one. But in my opinion, Dark Souls, no comment on Dark Souls 2, but Dark Souls is definitely a Metroidvania game. It starts off and you're kind of linear and you're kind of restricted, and then you get to a certain point where you get new abilities and new capacity to get around. And it's not really gated in, like, needing the fire beam to get through the fire door so much as I can't actually deal with this right now, so maybe I'm going to go try this other route and maybe see what else I can find. And one thing Dark Souls does that is very indicative of a good Metroidvania game is it genuinely rewards exploration. The Metroidvania game I'm most reminded of when it comes to Dark Souls is actually Metroid Prime. For those of you not aware, Metroid Prime is in my top 20 list, aka the games that are in the art category that then are even better than that. Best games of all time, in other words. It's actually like 24 games at this point, but I digress. So I mention this because the comparisons between the two games are astounding. I mean, I'm hesitant if I want to get into this just yet, but there's a lot of atmosphere. There's a lot of beautifully designed sets, lots of gorgeous scenery to go through. And in both cases, that scenery actually serves a story function, a setting function specifically, in addition to just being pretty in the background. It is being used as a tool for storytelling. And I'll just get into this. Dark Souls is probably the single best example of gameplay and story integration I've ever seen in my life. Other notable examples include the original Half-Life, as I've talked about before. Let me explain my comment, because this relates to Metroid Prime, which did a similar thing, although Metroid Prime had a little bit more plot focus than Dark Souls does. Dark Souls' plot is actually very, very threadbare and very ill-explained because of the gameplay and story integration. I'm going to try and explain this the best as I can, and I'm going to fail miserably. The first layer of Dark Souls' gameplay story integration, its presentation, the way it approaches getting you into the setting, the story. Remember, story is plot, characters, character growth, setting, and theme. Okay, this is the story. To reiterate, for anybody who hasn't seen me talk about this before, okay? So, when it comes to the story, it starts right off the ground floor with that difficulty thing I already talked about, with the punishing gameplay. Because that overall services in the theme of Dark Souls, which I'll be talking about more in a bit. The idea that if you don't constantly do your best, entropy will inevitably pull you down. You will always be failing. You will always be struggling just to maintain your status quo. And if any time you lose, you lose permanently. You never get to go back up a step, right? I mean, that's all over the prologue, for God's sakes. The idea of the flame dying out and the embers and, the whole plague of undeath because one person decided, hey, no, I want to keep this going. First step is simply the very game design choice that went into it. Second step is also a game design choice. Again, just like Half-Life, and to a similar extent, just like many of the Metroids, you determine how much the story exists. Yes, exists. How much you care about the story, how much the story affects you, how much of a story there even is there is fully dependent on you, the player. You could read into this game for hours. I could probably sit and just debate with several people who are into this game about nuances of the lore and the setting and all that fun stuff and the themes for hours. I'm not going to do that here. But feel free to converse with me on the forum if you want to. Yes, I have a forum. I probably should link that here. I'll go ahead and link the forum in my little postscript thing. But anyways, but the point is, you decide how much of that is actually there, because you can interpret it as much as you want. Like that's where I was. You can interpret it as much as you want. You could read into it as much as you want, and that's a gray thing. It's not like there's a story or there isn't. How much you read into it is fully dynamic and based solely on one variable, and that variable is you. You could totally ignore this game's story. You could practically dismiss this game's story. I am an undead, because it's hard to deny that, who is trying to destroy or kill things. Maybe you're a psychopath. Maybe you're just a raging undead who has no mind, who is literally a mindless killer. Maybe you're some kind of force of nature that's going through and trying to correct an imbalance in the world. Maybe you're some kind of long-lost reincarnation of a previous soul, like the damn pygmy. I've heard that theory a lot of times. You know, the point is, I've heard literally dozens of theories on Dark Souls plots, and in my opinion, basically all of them, except for the My Little Pony one, are valid. Yes, I have heard of My Little Pony. Let's not get into it. In my opinion, they're all valid. That's the beauty of that gameplay story integration. And we're only at the second step. Now, the third step is its bare bones approach also enables you... It does something that books do. It deliberately goes out of its way to not show you insight, so that you have to decide certain things for yourself. You have to decide tone. You have to decide... impression, you have to decide intent, you have to decide what layers of subtlety exist there. So much of this comes in the little flavor text, the flavor text that shows up on items. Arguably, all of the lore of Dark Souls shows up in that flavor text. But I would argue against that, and for the reason I'll get to next. But you get to decide how much of that is literal, how much of that is interpretive. I mean, we do know for almost a defined fact in Dark Souls 2, forgive me for skipping ahead a bit, no, I'm not doing Rumination in Dark Souls 2, but we do know in Dark Souls 2 they refer to the events in this game incorrectly, because it's been in a certain number of years here, and that's what happens to information over time. It gets recalled improperly and told improperly, and it gets passed down, and it just kind of gets messed with over time. This happens in real life. Have you ever played the telephone game? For those of you not aware, and I don't know if this is actually a thing in Europe, because I've actually never seen this outside of, well, to be honest, California, but the telephone game is, I'm going to tell Bob here something, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? I tell him something, and then he tells someone something, and then he tells someone something, and as you go down the links in the chain, the story will get changed over time, even if you do it in a closed environment. In other words, if we entered a soundproof room and I tell Bob something, and I leave, and Jill comes in, and he tells Jill something, and then he leaves, and then another woman comes in, and they talk, and it just keeps doing that, even without the possibility of your impressions of the telephone game changing it, that information will change over time. So we do know that at least some, if not arguably all, of the information presented of the setting and the lore and the flavor text might not actually be accurate, or indeed might not be literal. And that's the other thing, because it's entirely possible that what is being written and what is being stated is absolutely true, just not literally true. That's not what actually happened. It's more like something happened that was occurring in a similar vein to this. This is something that real-life archaeologists and I can't remember the other profession that really does that, forgive me, and historians, for that matter, really, really dig into in real life. And I admit, as a bit of a historical geek myself, I found that concept fascinating, trying to interpret old writings. Because, for God's sakes, figure of speech alone could destroy communication. Think about how different figures of speech are right now, as opposed to when I was born, years ago. Seriously, though, go back a few decades, and people are already using different manners of speech and dialogue. Go back about a century, and try to interact with someone a century ago, and their dialect will be so different that they will literally not understand certain things you say. Now, they can be made to understand, but that requires the interaction to give context. You see where I'm going with this. This is another reason Dark Souls is so beautifully written and so beautifully designed. Because it plays off of that exact same need for human beings to not only interpret, us the gamers, but in character, it plays off the need for human beings to embellish. Because we know embellishment happens. We all have had that temptation at one point or another in our lives. I could tell you, there's actually a rather famous story by Scott Adams, I think? The gentleman who writes Dilbert. It was in one of his books, and it was probably one of the most insightful things I've ever read him say, specifically. Not in general. You know, it's not the most insightful thing ever, but of the stuff I've read of his stuff, it was insightful. Because the whole point was, context and delivery mean anything. Embellishment can change a story that is, in his case, I went to the bathroom and slapped myself with the bandage of my underwear. I'm not going to repeat it, but he made this like 2-paragraph thing which made the whole thing much, much funnier and more lived up because he embellished it. Don't you think people writing down information about the past and whatnot would also be inclined to embellish to make it sound a little bit more interesting or a little bit more engaging than it actually was? That brings me to my next point, arguably my final point of the interpretive nature of this game's narrative, and that is, in my opinion, like the main character of Dark Souls. No, not the player character. The world. The world of Dark Souls. The setting. The vistas. I talked about this briefly before in the Metroid Prime comparison. The fact that you go to these wonderful, grandiose halls, and these dark, dank pits, and these chaotic things, and the crystal caves, and the spider area, and I fail at words to describe how monumentally incredible Dark Souls is with its terrain design, with its setting, with its showing that, because it's not just gorgeous to look at, even though it is gorgeous to look at, but it is also something that, again, tells the story. Arguably better than anything else does, which is why I wanted to bring this up last. We see, and we can interpret, in these places what once was, what was trying to be, what is now, what was just in between then and now, what might be in the future. We get to see decay and rot and cultural stagnation and architectural brilliance and wealth and just people, you know, that whole embellishment thing. Architecture is another interesting way in which human beings embellish. I am a king. I could live in a simple castle, but which is well fortified and well designed, but no, I am a king of men. I want to be seen as a king of men, so I will order my architects to make me something that is worthy of my station, thereby embellishing my story. And so we see again that beautiful interpretation being displayed everywhere. And if nothing else, the sheer grandiose and faded glory and the style of its incredibleness. Oh my god, and the fact that if you... I just gotta add, the fact that if you kill... I can't even remember her name. The illusion chick, who isn't actually real. The sun sets like forever. That just spoke volumes to me. I don't even know where to start on that. Brilliant design. Brilliant stuff. And the fact that you can basically go anywhere you can see is also really, really good game design, in my opinion. There is a time and place for linear gameplay, for what is nowadays kind of derogatorily called corridor syndrome, or if you prefer Final Fantasy XIII syndrome, depending on how derogatory you feel like being. But it is worth noting that there's nothing really wrong with corridor syndrome, as long as you're using it properly and have decent skyboxes and whatnot set up to make it look nice. But I have always personally, in my opinion, been more enjoyable of when I get to see the world, and whatever I see, I can go get to. I can go to that tower I see in the distance. I could go climb up that cliff. I could go down into that cave, into that pit. If I see it, I can go there. That also ties in nicely with that explorative nature of the game I mentioned earlier. And while I'm on the subject, the fact that you can basically kill pretty much anything and everything in this game, NPC-wise, also, as much as it's kind of horrible, does very much add to the explorative nature of the game, because it gives you that one incredibly essential thing that gamers crave and can never truly have, ironically. It's a wonderful little paradox, and that is freedom. You can never have a truly free game. Such a thing as a fantasy. A holodeck would be a truly free game because it has that pseudo-sentient AI that can interpret you on the fly, right? A video game will never actually be at that level. But video games have tried since the NES and original computer era in order to give you as much of an illusion of freedom, or indeed little snippets of freedom as it can, because we as gamers crave that. We want to be able to do what we choose to do, which again ties into that interpretive thing. How you interact with those NPCs. There's no karma meter. There's no reputation bar. Well, okay, there kind of is with the covenants. But the point is, you could try to be as good or as bad or as in between or as fleshed out or as one-dimensional of a character as you choose to, partially because of that choice. I gotta check my notes. I've just kind of bounced everywhere on that little speech. I want to talk about that, definitely. And for those curious, I went with pyromancy. I did not go into Dark Souls completely blind. I've actually been following Dark Souls' well, this is actually a while. About a year ago, I followed Dark Souls' speedrunning community reasonably well, and was therefore well aware of several tips, tricks, and otherwise strategies that I probably would have been completely ignorant of had I not already been aware of that. So I went with pyromancy, and it was actually a lot of fun. Still not what I would call, easy, but that is, of course, my interpretation of the game. Wow, I may actually be kind of out of things to talk about. Except for the big ones, of course. Let's go ahead and talk about the barrier to entry thing. I think I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier. I meant to. I think the biggest problem with Dark Souls is twofold. I mentioned that elitism thing earlier, and that is because there is a significant barrier to entry to Dark Souls. This is true for a lot of games. For those who don't know what I mean, it means a barrier to entry literally means how difficult it is to get invested in a game, not how difficult it is to play. Because, playing it is just you download it off Steam and you play it. That's a different barrier. That's like barrier to access, and that's almost never discussed. See Suikoden 2 up until about a month ago for a good example of barrier to access. No, this is barrier to entry. In other words, how difficult it is to really get into the game. Dark Souls is pretty bad, and that is a shame in my opinion. Because the very first thing the game does is, okay, you're here, minimalist, no tutorial, blah blah blah, boss fight. The fat demon, I don't even remember its damn name. And you're actually, by design, the first time you play the game, you're supposed to die to that guy. I didn't, because I knew he was coming, and I was a pyromancer, and I knew his weak points. But you are supposed to, by design, die to that guy the first time you see him, which then kind of keeps you going. But the point is, a lot of new players, even if they would want to play this game, they're going to see that and just kind of like, ugh. And again, it takes a while to get to that point where you really get to that open Metroid feeling I mentioned earlier. So it's one of those really horrible situations where the phrase, it gets better later, is both true and false. Because it does get better later, in my opinion. First part of the game really, really was dull to me. It wasn't until it opened up and I could do more that I started actually enjoying myself. The reason I say that is also false, however, is it gets better later, in my opinion, should never actually be the qualifying statement for something being gotten into. Like, if I can explain what I mean a little bit better. I don't, right now especially, I do not have what you would call free time. No, I really don't. I am watching a 2-year-old 5 days out of the week, sometimes 6 or 7 days out of the week, depending on where she is that particular week. And I'm trying to keep up with the show that you're watching right now. So I don't actually have free time. Now, this is not, oh, pity me or whatever, because I know about 90% of you, maybe? That's an exaggeration. I know a lot of you are in the same boat I am. You may not have the same situation, but either between school or work and your other work, or work and school at the same time, or whatever, you don't have that much free time. When you don't have a lot of free time, being told a game gets better later just makes you think, okay, that's great. When I have spare time, not free time, spare time, I'll go and look at it. which may never happen. You see where I'm going with this? That's why I say that's not really a valid statement under certain circumstances, because while it may be true, that doesn't quite justify it. It's probably my biggest single complaint design-wise about Dark Souls. That is that barrier to entry. And the sad thing is, I'm not sure it would be possible to do it otherwise. Not really. Not unless you really, really shortened the intro section to like a tutorial level degree, like the Metroids do, actually. And then was like, okay, and now world. I can just picture how many people in the comment section are saying, well, I breezed through the intro section in like 10 minutes. I don't know what their problem is. Elitism, blah, blah, blah. Now, that barrier to entry thing, and the elitism thing, I wanted to mention this as well with regards to that. One of the things I don't like about the elitist thing that I see a small vocal minority. I don't want to make that clear, because most people I've talked to who genuinely enjoy Dark Souls are not in this category. They are not people who are elitist jerks, who are jackasses, who constantly like to preach in a form of vainglorious, self-congratulatory pride about how this game's easy, or I managed this, or I can do this under these circumstances, you know, blah, blah, blah. No, 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 no. That's not the people who are watching my video right now. At least in my experience. Most of the people who talk to me about Dark Souls just genuinely like the game. But the vocal minority that I've seen of that is of that exact category. The people who are smug bastards, who will not shut up about how, oh yeah, you know, you're not playing this game for real unless you're playing it under insert limited restrictions here. I actually anticipate people will bash me in a similar fashion because I use pyromancy, which is well known to be kind of broken if you know how to use it in Dark Souls. Admittedly. In my defense, didn't have that much time to burn through this game. It already took me too long. But the last reason I want to bring this up is because I feel like it's the second barrier to entry. One of the things that is most well known about Dark Souls is that it's difficult. And yet that doesn't even begin to explain the game. And as I've said before, calling the game just flat difficult, the fact that its only defining feature is that it's hard, is disingenuous. It's not even that accurate, if you can forgive me if you're being blunt. It definitely has punishing gameplay, but calling it difficult as its only feature? No. This is a very atmospheric, very depressing, very well-constructed, interpretive piece with a rich and well-invested story, or setting at least, and theme. This is a game that encourages you not to button mash, by design. This is a game that encourages you to think about what you're doing and why. And if you choose not to think about what you're doing, it will also let you do that. All these things are nuances that are missed because, oh, it's a hard game. And that's why I say that's the second barrier to entry. Because too many people are going to look at that and say, hard equals frustration. Which is not true, by the way. I've often said that, you know, in my own personal Arshian Gaia lexicon, difficulty is something that can be enjoyed. Even when it is not enjoyed, however, it is not frustration. Frustration is the step down from difficulty. Frustration is usually engendered by artificial difficulty or by bad design choice. I've talked about examples of this in the past. But the problem is, most people, when you think about difficulty, that's what you're going to think about, isn't it? Let's say I recommend insert game A to you, and the only thing I tell you about it is that it's really hard. And that's all I tell you about it. And that's all you hear about it. And you hear about some people talking about, oh, I had so much difficulty, blah, 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 or I had such an easy time with this, blah, blah, blah. All you're going to take from that is, well, I might be able to play it, but at the same time I might be controller-flinging frustrated by it, right? I mean, granted, I'm assuming here, but you get the point I'm trying to get across. It's a beautiful irony because the game's own punishing market, the vocal minority of that market, is one of the greatest causes why, in my opinion, more people have not picked up Dark Souls. For the reference, the difficulty thing was not a reason I didn't pick up Dark Souls. I said before, and I said again, Dark Souls was coffee to me. I had to come up with that phrase specifically to define Dark Souls because I was asked about it so bloody much that I got sick of it. And I was like, okay, guys, listen. I'm going to come up with a new term in my dictionary to explain what Dark Souls is. It's coffee. It's not my thing. And that had nothing to do with gameplay. If you were paying attention, I really liked the gameplay of this game. The combat was, stick and move, stick and move. Gameplay was fun. But now I'm going to explain why I didn't actually like this game. This game's theme is always going to be interpreted. And I just know, in fact, I know for a fact there are 3 people who have messaged me wanting to know my interpretation of Dark Souls, which is what I'm going to give you now. Now, I could say that Dark Souls is about a dying world which is trying to either linger on or finally die, but that's not really saying anything, if you can forgive me for being blunt. That's practically said in the actual narrative. That's like the bare skeleton structure of it. How that works, whether or not it is hopeful or depressing or engendering or futile or mechanical or natural, or again, the dozens of different theories I've heard about this story, that's what's your interpretation. So, my interpretation of Dark Souls is that Dark Souls is a fantastical way to shine a light in Allegory on real life. In real life, you are born, you grow, you try to learn, you accomplish things you're proud of. You have your glory days, you do great things. You look back with fondness at them. Echoes and memories, after a while, are all you have left of those glory days, because the longer you go on, the longer you continue to exist, the more you rot. The more you melt away into a vague caricature of what you used to be, to the point where you can only dream of accomplishing the things you once did. Till it gets to the point where all you can see before you is the inevitable futility of the fact that if you try your best and work hard every day, constantly in an unending struggle, and get lucky, all you can do is maintain that status quo. Remember I mentioned that way back at the beginning. All you can do is hold ground. And if you don't get lucky, and if you don't try your hardest, and if you slip up, you lose a notch. And you can never regain that much. You can never get back up. You only lose points. You never gain them. And it's just this slow, inevitable slog through misery and decay until it reaches the point where all you could think about is one of 2 things, depending on your personal interpretation of that. Either I must endure, or I must end. And just like in real life, there are only 2 options. You can choose to survive and fight back for whatever dozens, if not thousands, of reasons there can be to do that. Or you can die. And the final way the game actually beautifully works in this to gameplay and story integration is that you, the main character, cannot die. You can't. If you die in combat, you get right back up. The last bonfire you were at. The futility of it, the inevitability of it, the fact that you don't even have a choice in the matter, the fact that you are literally powerless to do anything except for continue the slog, just hammers that point in like a damn maul beating my face in. And that's my interpretation of Dark Souls. I have decided to not say anything else. I was originally going to end this on a different note. Instead, I'll just say what I always say.